mic's not on.
It is on. It's on, it's on. I'm just not close enough to it. That's probably it. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah.
Okay. It got real quiet. Are you ready? Welcome, everyone. Nice to see such great turnout. Thank you all for coming out. I am Hillary Delaney. If you don't know me, I am the president of the Boone County Historical Society. And tonight we are so lucky to have Joetta Crow. She just explained to me, and I've known her for several years, that I've been pronouncing her last name. So I'm glad to learn that. Joetta and I have collaborated quite a bit on research during her time here, and a lot of it has been focused on what you're going to learn about tonight with her Universalist church research. It's fascinating stuff. If you read a little bit about the program when you decided to come in and hear the talk, you know that Boone County actually had 2 Universalist churches that coexisted at the same time. And I'm laughing about that because we didn't know that. I work in local history as well. So we always thought one and then they moved it. But no, they actually were both in operation at the same time, so that was a new thing. And Joetta's going to talk a little bit about this, but they were considered sort of radical for a number of reasons, one of which was their views on enslavement, and that could cause some ripples within families and the community, especially in a slaveholding state at the time. So for those of you that aren't members, I welcome you to stay for the meeting that we'll have afterwards, and we have cookies and lemonade if I can bribe you. So I will not waste any more time, and I'll give you Joetta.
Yeah.
I realize it's always good to have some water handy, right? Speaking. Well, hi. I am so glad to be here with you all this evening. Let's see, how's the mic? Pretty good?
Pretty good. Good.
Are you good, Steve? Okay, good. For a long-delayed presentation, as you will hear, this was originally conceived back in 2019. So, and I've been working on it longer than that. So, I want to begin actually by explaining how I got interested in this topic that we're going to discuss tonight. I suspect that many of you, at least those who are members of the society, are sort of like me, kind of amateur historians, folks with a deep interest or passion for history, want to love the local history, or maybe broader than that even. Maybe you started by researching your ancestors, or you have an interest in events that happened here in Boone County or elsewhere. So for me, I'm a retired psychologist, and I guess in that job and in my life, I've pretty much always been curious about people and about history, especially as it pertains to the present and how history lays the groundwork for today's people and events. So in 2019, we moved to Hebron to be near family after living for 20 years in Atlanta. And as you may know, Atlanta is a place where history before and after the Civil War is very tangible. I wanted to do, once I moved here, what I had done while living in Georgia, which was to develop a deeper understanding of where I was, this place, in this case, called Northern Kentucky. So I turned to the amazing Boone County Public Library as a resource, and in 2016, we participated in the library's Underground Railroad tour, bus tour, which they just offered again about 10 days ago. If you haven't done that, I highly recommend it. So here, let's see if okay, good for the slides here. Hopefully I'll keep up with that appropriately. Here's the map that's used for the tour. And halfway through that bus tour of Boone County and Underground Railroad sites, Hillary Delaney, who most of you in the room know, or maybe it was one of the other talented and dedicated staff of the Borderlands Archive and History Center. I can't actually remember who on the bus said it at that moment, but someone said that the members of the Universalist Church had likely been involved in Underground Railroad activities. But I was astonished to see the Universalist Church on the library's tour map. Well, not surprising to me that Universalists might have taken action to support people who were fleeing slavery, but it was mostly that I was just amazed to learn that a Universalist church had existed in Boone County back then. You see, I've been a Unitarian Universalist, or what we call a UU, for, 35, almost 40 years, and I'm currently a member of St. John's Unitarian Universalist Church in Cincinnati. It's one of 4 in the city, and it's one of about 1,200 congregations around the country. Several of my friends from St. John's are here with me tonight, and I appreciate them being here. That library bus trip and seeing this map was what initiated my project and created my desire to better understand the Universalist history here. Because Unitarian Universalism is a small denomination and not always well known, you may not have heard of us before, so I want to offer a couple kind of bullet points to get you oriented. Both the Unitarian and Universalist denominations have roots going back at least to the 1500s, evolving out of Protestant faith, and some famous Unitarians that you've heard of and may not know were Unitarians will include John Adams, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Louisa May Alcott, and many others. Unitarianism was very strong in the Northeast, and even today, there are 138 UU congregations in the state of Massachusetts, pretty small area. Universalism was brought to this country about 300 years ago from England, and you'll hear more about that history of Universalism here in a minute. But in 1960, the Unitarians and the Universalists joined together to form the Unitarian Universalist Association. Ours is a liberal faith that is congregational in governance, which means similar to the Baptists, there's no UU pope or bishop, and our congregations ordain and call their own ministers. Membership in the Unitarian Universalist faith is not based on acceptance of a specific theological dogma or creed, but rather on a commitment to covenant and how we agree to act and the principles that we operate on. And here are kind of a quick summary of our basic principles. Our first principle is to honor the inherent worth and dignity of every individual. And our long history of social justice work is also reflected in the principles. So that's really enough about Unitarian Universalism today. I won't evangelize any further. But now let's go to who were the Universalists of the 1800s and how did they end up in Boone County? So this is just a placeholder picture. I really liked it. It's a painting by Edward Hopper of the Universalist Church. Universalists were liberal Protestants whose name reflected a central tenet of their faith. Unlike their Puritan forefathers, they believed that God granted salvation to all human beings. Until the 19th century, almost all Christian theologians had preached of eternal torment in hell, hellfire and damnation was the common message. In contrast, the defining theology of Universalism was universal salvation. Universalists believed that the God of love would not create a person knowing that that person would be destined for eternal damnation. They concluded that all people must be destined for salvation. Some early Universalists believed that after death there was a period of reprobation in hell preceding salvation. I think of this as kind of similar to the concept of purgatory. Other Universalists denied the existence of hell entirely, notably Hosea Ballou, who converted to Universalism in 1789 and evangelized for more than 50 years. Ballou also preached that when Christianity emphasized God as wrathful, this resulted in a hardening of the hearts of believers. Universalism was popular among farmers, tradesmen, and shopkeepers, and was actually the 6th largest denomination in the U.S. at its peak in the 1800s. How did this faith take root in northern Kentucky? Well, we don't know who first preached about universal salvation around here, but by the late 1820s, things were happening in our general region. The First Universalist Church of Cincinnati was founded in 1827, and their first pastor, was Hosea Ballew's son-in-law. In Louisville, the first preacher to bring the Universalist message in the early 1820s was Jonathan Kidwell, who was born in Salt Lick, Kentucky. Later, Kidwell lived in Cincinnati and southeast Indiana, planting the seeds of many small Universalist congregations in the area. As a local circuit rider, Kidwell may well have been the person who carried the Universalist message to and through northern Kentucky. So you might have guessed this, but I want to confirm that this universal salvation thing, well, it was controversial. Those who opposed universalism, and they did so very actively, said that the devil inspired the Universalists to lead people astray by teaching them there was no hell. After all, without the threat of punishment in hell, people would feel free to behave in whatever destructive or evil ways they chose, thereby serving the devil's mission. Well, all over the country, the Universalists evangelized and proselytized by holding public debates with those whom they called, get ready, the partialists. The Universalists and the partialists. One of the famous examples, titled A Debate on the Doctrine of Universal Salvation, took place for 8 successive nights in Cincinnati in 1845, with the Reverend Pingree, a well-known Universalist minister from Louisville, debating the pastor of Cincinnati's Central Presbyterian Church. From reading the accounts of these debates, it was quite a theological showdown. Today, we might be forgiven for assuming that, given their theological stance, all Universalist ministers and congregations leaned toward abolition. However, this was not actually a given for Universalist ministers in southern states. It was more complicated than that. UU amateur historian Pete Avery finds that there were 19 Universalist ministers in Kentucky in 1845, and none of them decided to co-sign a slavery protest statement that year. In their memoirs, some ministers serving in the upper and deep South during this era wrote of fearing conflict within their congregation if they took too strong of a stance regarding abolition. Anyone who studied the times knows that it was very complicated. And a few of these ministers were actually enslavers themselves. In the northeastern U.S., where Universalism had very deep roots and prevalence, the sentiment was much different. Well, with any history project, one spends some time discovering the existence of and then digging through old documents, right? Yeah. I see heads nodding. Well, for me, one of the key finds was the annual report of the Universalist denomination in America. This is just a sample here of the statistics, the first part of the Universalist Register. It has different names over time, the register, different names, but it's basically an annual report. It lists the congregations in each state, identifies ministers who were ordained, and acknowledged ministerial deaths, that sort of thing. So, using this document and the records of the church, what did I discover about Boone County? The first Universalist church of Boone County was formed in 1847. And like many new congregations, it took the folks in Boone County a bit of time to get fully established. And then by 1849, we know from Hillary's research and other information. What'd you say?
Your research.
Well, we know that Jesse and Jane Kelly donated land on their property to build the church. It was located on Kelly Lane, about 6 miles outside of Burlington, near Middle Creek. The Kelly family members were Universalists. Here are photos showing a current building and the small cemetery there. Their farm, located, you can see here, you can see the river, and you can see Middle Creek highlighted, and then where the Universalist church is and the Kellys' residence. Their farm was a good location for assisting those attempting to escape across the river. That's part of our reason for believing that they were involved with the Underground Railroad. Okay, in 1849, the Universalist annual report, in that report, the Boone County congregation was mentioned as a new meeting house. See it there, Boone County? Can you all see that well enough? Okay, great. And as one of 12 groups meeting in Kentucky. By the way, nearby Indiana, there were congregations forming along the Ohio River. I picked out some that are in familiar locations: Vevey, Lawrenceburg, Switzerland County. However, Rising Sun does not yet exist, which is interesting because we know that became a prominent Universalist church eventually. Let's see. I want to note that our circuit riding evangelist who hailed from Salt Lake, he had just died that year. See, his death is noted down there at the bottom, in 1849. So some of you know the joy of an aha moment when you learn something so fascinating that it sends you down many other rabbit holes in search of more, right? Oh yeah. Well, that happened for me when the Universalist Register annual listings for Kentucky showed A.G. Gaines at serving the young Boone County congregation during 1850, 1851, and 1852. Wait, what? Who was A.G. Gaines? His full name was Absalom Graves Gaines, and the register listed him as still in training, that little symbol before his name, and he was still in training. And he may have been serving under the mentorship of the minister referenced from Cincinnati. So we don't know a lot of information about the early church activity near Middle Creek, but we know that during the period when Reverend Gaines, or going to be Reverend, he wasn't Reverend yet, but he was working on it, Gaines was serving the church. The congregation showed off its brand new meeting house in 1851 when it hosted the state convention of Universalists. That's what that little message there says, which I typed over to the side. And we know that in 1853 there was a big Universalist gathering in Boone County. Now, this is the map that shows you where. Think revival meeting with several ministers coming to preach near Rabbit Hash. Okay, get ready for it. Here's an account from one of the ministers who preached there. From Rising Sun we mounted our steed and took passage on the ferry boat for the Kentucky shore. On our arrival at the ground, our vision was greeted by a sight which we have seldom witnessed. Such a multitude of people in carriages and on horseback. Our soul was truly refreshed to see such an interest manifested to hear the word. We delivered 2 sermons to the multitude, and we have every reason to believe that the seed fell into good ground. I love that. Okay, after 1852, the Universalist Almanac lists no permanent minister for the Boone County Church, although there are references to ministers in the area who probably preached there sometimes. What was exciting to me was that I had discovered a thread I could follow to learn about a particular Universalist minister in Boone County who turned out, as Hillary helped me learn, to be a local person with interesting roots. And he was preaching the universal salvation message here in our county. But I'm going to hold you in suspense before I tell you more about Absalom. Let's remind ourselves about what was happening in the world during this decade prior to the Civil War. First of all, we know that millions of African Americans enslaved in this country between 1619 and 1865 demonstrated bravery beyond our comprehension in coping with the cruelty of slavery. They survived despite the odds and escaped when possible. Between 1800 and 1865, the Underground Railroad, as it came to be known, is thought to have helped perhaps as many as 70,000 people, although I think the estimates on that are very ballpark, from 40 to 100,000. Here in the northern Kentucky borderlands, enslaved people definitely knew that freedom was within sight across the Ohio River. So, here are a couple bullet points to remind us of the context in which our Universalist story is unfolding. Some of you know, I'm sure, about the so-called Kentucky Raids in 1847, which were an effort to recapture African Americans who had escaped Boone County and Kenton County and were living in Michigan. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, making things even more difficult for freedom seekers if they were recaptured after they made it across the Mason-Dixon line. By the way, there's an excellent book about the Fugitive Slave Act that I highly recommend, and I brought my copy up here if you want to glance at it. It's called The War Before the War, Fugitive Slaves and the Struggle for America's Soul from the Revolution to the Civil War. In 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin was published, and that same year, Congress repealed the Missouri Compromise, opening Western territories to slavery and setting the stage for a bloody struggle between pro- and anti-slavery forces in Kansas Territory. The Republican Party, which was newly formed from various groups opposing the extension of slavery, held its first convention in 1856, and the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision declared in 1857 that black people, whether free or slave, had no citizenship rights. And, of course, many of you in this room know well the story of Margaret Garner, who, with her family and a group of other Boone County enslaved persons, escaped across the frozen Ohio River on January 27, 1856. For those who need a recap, in case you're not acquainted, the Garner family was recaptured in Cincinnati. Knowing the family would be sent back to slavery, Margaret cut the throat of one of her children and attempted to take the lives of the other three before being subdued. Newspapers all over the country carried this story, including following the lengthy trial that ensued to determine whether Margaret would face charges for murder in the free state of Ohio or be returned to Kentucky due to the Fugitive Slave Act. Margaret's enslaver, who is now assumed to be the biological father of several of her children, was Archibald Gaines, a farmer in Boone County. Gaines was known to be an especially cruel man who had been involved in the so-called slave patrols, trying to recapture people who had escaped to freedom. The story became way more interesting for me when Hillary identified that Archibald Gaines, the enslaver of Margaret Garner, was the older cousin of Absalom Graves Gaines, who had served the First Universalist Church from 1850 to 52. So, now let's learn more about A.G. Gaines. After his internship serving the young Boone County Church, Gaines left in 1852 to teach natural sciences at Clinton Liberal Institute near Canton, New York. This school, this college, founded by Universalists, had opened a theological school where Gaines studied in preparation for ordination. In Canton, he met, courted, and married Emma, and he and his New York native wife returned to Boone County with their infant son, Charles, in 1855. Sidebar, I recently discovered that there are their courtship letters in the archives in Canton, and have begun to dip into that. We know that he was here in Boone County in 1855, in that time frame, because of the ever-amazing Hillary Delaney and her ability to find that information in the 1856 Boone County tax rolls. He may have been teaching locally, we don't really know. So remember, that was 1855-56. January 1856 was the date of the daring escape across the frozen river by Margaret Garner. The newspapers went wild reporting the story of Margaret's desperate actions. Everyone in Cincinnati, in Kentucky, and all over the country knew of this story. So what did Absalom and his wife do later that same year? They left Kentucky, and he accepted a ministry position in Bethel, Maine, where he was ordained by his new congregation in 1857. I believe that these two events, Margaret's well-publicized tragedy and Reverend Gaines leaving his home in Kentucky, were not unrelated. My reason for saying that is that 46 years later, in 1903, Reverend Absalom Gaines' obituary included this statement: Reverend Gaines' uncompromising opposition to slavery induced him in 1856 to leave the South for Universalist ministry positions in Maine and New York. As a psychologist, I have pondered the complex family dynamics faced by Absalom regarding his family members' stance on slavery. I imagine that the young minister was especially disheartened by his cousin's behavior, so much so that long after departing Kentucky, he apparently told colleagues in New York about his reason for leaving. I have wondered what earlier experiences led Reverend Gaines to become a Universalist in the first place and come to this perspective about slavery. After all, he grew up in Boone County, steeped in the slaveholding culture that was prevalent here. In the late 1700s, his ancestors had come from Virginia, bringing not only their families but also the enslaved persons who they considered to be their property. Homesteads in our area were not very large, not like the cotton plantations in the South, but many families claimed ownership of a small number of African American men, women, and children. Enslaved African Americans constituted about 20% of the population of the county during the first half of the 1800s. Absalom grew up privileged and attended Morgan Academy. You've probably heard of Morgan Academy. It was right here in downtown, not right here, right there in downtown Burlington. And it was a private school where some of the students were from wealthy Indiana or Ohio families. His father, Richard, was an enslaver, and the family belonged to the Baptist Church. In 1849, 1850, Absalom completed a course of study in sciences and moral philosophy at the University of Virginia, where the vast majority of students hailed from wealthy Southern slaveholding families, and it was definitely not a bastion of Universalism or abolition. All the while, Absalom was preparing to be a Universalist minister. How did this happen? Well, remember how I described Universalist ministers debating those who they labeled as partialists? The future Reverend Gaines would have been about 18 at the time of the famous 1845 Cincinnati debate, so perhaps he attended or read the very extensive news coverage about the debates, thereby learning about Universalist theology. Hillary has suggested to me that it may have been the women in his life, perhaps his stepmother who held different beliefs, or maybe his relationship with the enslaved people who were a part of his growing up years had a lasting impact. I like to believe that once exposed to the theology of universal salvation, he wanted to put that belief into action. We don't really know, but it is interesting to speculate. The way in which Boone County Universalists may have been assisting with the Underground Railroad in the 1850s also isn't fully known to us, but my hope is that while Reverend Gaines was preparing to follow his conscience and leave Kentucky, he offered his Boone County congregants encouragement in that important work. So what happened later in life for Reverend Gaines? Well, he served churches in Maine and New York. In 1863, he's shown on the military draft roster for the 2nd Congressional District of Maine when he was 36, 1 year too old for mandatory service in the Union Army. In the 1870s, he pursued a doctorate, received the very first doctorate of divinity granted by Tufts University, and became a highly esteemed professor and then president of St. Lawrence University, a Universalist institution in Canton, New York. I've gathered lots more information about his long and successful career, but that could be a whole nother hour. Steve's already told me, watch your time, so I'll save all that. I do want to share a quote, though, from a sort of who's who biography written about Gaines about 3 years before he died. It's a lovely, long article, but I love this quote. As a preacher and lecturer, his style is characterized by a plain and earnest eloquence that never fails to make an impression. During those years he lived in the Northeast, the Reverend Dr. Gaines occasionally returned to Boone County, probably to visit family. Hillary found In the diary of Petersburg, Kentucky resident Louis Loder, probably many of you know about that diary, these notations: 6 February 1860, preaching in the Christian church by Absalom Gaines, a universal preacher. And then this one, July 30, 1878, Ab Gaines' son and wife from New York were impeached. He also returned to preach at the First Universalist Church of Burlington in 1883, 1889, and 1890, but wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's go back to our Boone County church down there in Middle Creek. What happened to the Universalist congregations during the chaos of the Civil War? Okay, we're up to the 1860s now. Well, the Universalist Register offers some fascinating information, could be a whole lecture in and of itself, that there were ministers serving as union chaplains, that there were Universalist nurses, including Claire Barton, one of our famous Universalists, who were honored for their service at the end of the war. Many ministers have been lost track of, and looking at the data for Indiana, many congregations did not have ministers assigned to them, even in the border states north. The annual reports also paint a grim picture of the impact of the war upon congregations in Kentucky and what they call the southern states, with the Register noting all regional associations in Kentucky probably suspended by the rebellion. That's the language. And you see there the difference between 1859 and 1865. And that's all data from the annual reports. We don't really know how the church in rural Boone County survived, but apparently it did. And then, as Reconstruction was drawing to a close, a second Universalist congregation, calling itself the First Universalist Church of Burlington, formed on May 27, 1876. A new church was eventually built at the corner of Girard or Bulletsville Road and Purlock, across from what was then the May Lassing Mansion, or eventually became that mansion that's across the street there. Some of you probably know what I'm talking about. The library folks and I had initially assumed that here's the map so you can see where it is. The orange is the courthouse, the blue is the church, downtown Burlington. The library folks and I had initially assumed that the church built in downtown Burlington in 1879 was the second home of the same congregation that built the church in Middle Creek on the Kelly property 30 years earlier. But guess what? We now know that for a short time, there were two congregations, each with a small membership, a meeting house, and sometimes sharing a minister. I discovered this via those dusty documents. Okay, granted, it's virtual dust because they were all online documents, but you get my drift. The Universalist denominational records. So here's the denominational report for Kentucky for 1876, showing the two congregations now referenced as Middle Creek and Burlington. Burlington doesn't show any people with it yet because it just got started. All right. Let's see. And I'll come back to examine the parallel and divergent paths in just a minute. It's fun to read another old, virtually dusty document, the Burlington Church's record book. Here's a page from that record book from the very beginning. Oscar Gaines, there's that name again, Gaines, and Louisa Craven were two of the four people who were noted as received as members of the new congregation in May of 1876 by letter from First Universalist Church of Boone County near Middle Creek. This happened on the day the church was organized. This is a much later summary of who the organizers were. Oscar, a local farmer, was Reverend Absalom Gaines' first cousin, just 5 years younger than the Reverend. By the way, Oscar's home still exists over on Bulletsville Road, about halfway between downtown Burlington and Petersburg Road. Big farmhouse there, 2-story. In the first meeting of the new congregation, Oscar was elected as one of 2 deacons and went on to serve in many leadership roles within the church for 35 years until his death in 1912. This is just another page from the membership roster where people's signing the book and then also when they died being noted. Louisa Craven's husband, Noah, was elected treasurer that first day. Both Noah and Louisa Craven were active in the congregation also until their deaths. The library put together this list of some of the names of Boone County families that were engaged with the Universalist Church, according to the records. From reading the record book and a couple other sources, we know a bit about the life of the Burlington congregation. The newspaper reported that the dedicatory services, that was the word used, in 1879 for the new building were very lengthy. And it was noted that at the close of the service, the Lord's Supper was celebrated. And on that same day, they launched a Sunday school, complete with members serving as superintendent and assistants. One of them was Oscar, as well as a secretary and 2 librarians. The business of the church was conducted at least annually using the democratic process with both women and men serving in various leadership roles, including as representatives to regional and state Universalist gatherings. Typical services were held monthly with a variety of preachers, none ever fully there all the time. They were rotating preachers. Each notation of a service in the record book typically included what Bible story or verses were the focus of the sermon and a comment about the size of the gathering. The prodigal son and the parable of the lost sheep, you can see how those would fit with the universal salvation messages, and those were more than once the subject of sermons I noted in the book. Okay, so now let's circle back to look again at how the 2 congregations evolved and diverged. So I've summarized in 3 slides here the annual reports. On the left, Boone County, Middle Creek. On the right, Burlington. You can see there the time frames starting after the Civil War. And then here you can see 1878. The Burlington Church was meeting at the Methodist Church until they built their building. And they each had a small number of members, 28, 24. And the Universal annual report kept track of the value of the buildings and what they were built with. So that's how we know it was a brick building valued at $800 out there on the Kelly farm down there at Middle Creek, Peggy. And okay, then 1879, they had their new building. 1880, you can see they're sharing a preacher. And the new wooden building is valued at $2,600. 1883, the record shows the Middle Creek congregation as dormant, but still having their building, and as of 1900 not being listed. And in 1902, the building was sold and the proceeds were donated to the Burlington Church. I know that from the Burlington record book. By then they had 54 members. That was probably the high. And all those people from Middle Creek came to Burlington for church. The $55 proceeds were used to paint the Burlington Church. Okay, go back. All right, we'll leave it there for a second. We don't know why the formation of the Second Universalist Church occurred when it did in 1876. We do know that following the Civil War, there were many incidents of racial violence in northern Kentucky that were especially targeted at black soldiers returning to the area. Later, in 1876, a controversial election for U.S. president would bring about a negotiated end to the Reconstruction period, resulting in even more complex social upheaval and the beginning of what became known as the Jim Crow era. A few weeks following the first meeting of the Burlington congregation in 1876, there was a well-publicized lynching of a man named Smith Williams, a black man. And that was followed by the lynching of another black man, Joe Payne, that same month. In fact, June 1876 marks the beginning of a 10-year period of terror during which 7 documented lynchings occurred in our county. I want to read aloud the names of those victims in acknowledgement of them. Smith Williams, Joe Payne, Parker Mayo, Theodore Daniels, Charles Smith, Charles Dickerson, and William Sam Scales. Racial violence, and especially lynchings and murders, are difficult things to take in. And I want to acknowledge that this part of our county's story is painful. I became interested in this history in 2017 after hearing Brian Stevenson from the Equal Justice Initiative speak about the history of racial violence in the United States between 1870 and 1950. Some of you may be acquainted with his work in Montgomery, Alabama. Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative have researched over 6,400 lynchings, documenting this tragedy with the Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery. 169 of those documented lynchings occurred in Kentucky. Here are a couple photos of the memorial in Montgomery. Each of the monuments hanging in the memorial are labeled for a county where lynchings have been documented. The names of the victims are engraved in that county's monument. After hearing Stevenson speak, I wanted to understand our local history. I actually Googled Boone County, Kentucky lynching to see what history there was, and that's when I discovered that the library's local history department, as it was known then, had already gathered information about the 7 known victims who were lynched between 1876 and 1885. This is a screenshot of one of the library's resources on this topic. Okay, so now, did Joetta veer off course? How does this relate to my Universalist story? Well, I'll get there. As I understand it, the primary function of racial violence was to make sure that African Americans understood their place, maintaining racial control by victimizing the entire black community, not merely providing punishment of an alleged perpetrator for an alleged crime. The goal was to establish beyond any doubt that the caste system that was the legacy of slavery could not be challenged. It's also well known that there was an additional purpose for lynchings: to threaten and intimidate white people who were violating the social norms of the day by being supportive of the black community. Lynchings were sometimes conducted on the property of whites who had supported abolition or voting rights, or who had spoken or acted against racial violence. In fact, here in Boone County, that first lynching victim, Smith Williams, and a later victim, Charles Dickerson, were both murdered on the property of Noah and Louisa Craven. Just the location being just up Burlington Pike from here at the intersection with North Bend Road. We believe that as folks who were very well known to be Universalists, the Craven family was targeted in an effort to push back against anyone who might challenge the mob mentality. This image is taken from the library's story map, which captures graphically the stories of these 7 lynching victims. I have a handout with the link in case you would like to explore further and learn the stories of these men and their murders by mobs of Boone County residents. Hillary also has written very complete narratives, and the link for that is also in my little handout. As you might imagine, my visit to the National Memorial in Montgomery in August 2019 was a very powerful experience after learning of this history locally. Among the hundreds of markers, I located the one hung in recognition of Boone County, Kentucky victims. During COVID, a group of us here in Boone County began working with the library's assistants to form a community remembrance project to properly acknowledge and honor these victims. We will be working with the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery and hope to eventually have a marker installed in our county recognizing this history, painful though it is. If you are interested in learning more or joining us in this work, please speak to me or Hillary or my colleagues Jasmine and Jennifer, who are part of our working group, after the meeting. I also have a sheet you can just sign your name and give me your email if you would like to be in touch. I want to close with 3 heartwarming Universalist stories. The first is a reflection about the Burlington congregation from an outsider. Dr. Henry DeCourcy Adams, who in 1897 wrote a manuscript that the library has bound into a book titled My Remembrances of Burlington. It's a little hard to read, so I'll read it to you. He wrote, "The Universalist Church was located across the road from the Revel Lassing home. Met only a few times a year, the Oscar Gaines family, Bulletsville Road, were members. When there was to be a basket meeting, Mr. Gaines sent me advance notice and an invitation to his table. They served roast beef, a rarity. It is disparaging that I remember the dinners and not the sermons. Maybe all is not lost. This was a smiling, happy congregation. They seemed to be united in spirit and in worship. There were stalwarts in the other 3 churches, and it is difficult to shake off an inherited background, especially when there's not an effort or a wish to do so. But I am not so certain but that this Universalist was my favorite church." All right, here's story number 2. I don't have a picture for it, I guess, but you'll just have to hear it. The final entry in the Burlington Church record book, the last time they wrote something, is dated August 1929. Like many entries of the previous decade, in the 20s, this one was recorded by longtime member B.T. Kelly, who was the clerk of the church. His final note was, for a service, Reverend Thomas Chapman preached forenoon and evening on this date to a fairly good-sized congregation of attentive listeners. He forgot to list what it was he preached about. Hillary figured out the other day that B.T. Kelly was Benjamin, or Benny T. Kelly, one of the grandsons of Jesse and Jane Kelly, upon whose land the Middle Creek Church was built. Okay, here's my final story. In February 2019, a small group of ministers and lay leaders, you and others, including the Reverend Dan Cavalli, who's in the back there. He's the pastor of the Bulletsville Christian Church, and others, who you'll see in a minute, came together for a short tour that I led to share the Universalist history of Boone County. We eventually arrived at the location which had been the Noah and Louisa Craven farm, where at that time a barn still stood and a few daffodils were popping up in February. We paused to reflect on the horrors of the violence that had been done on that land, as well as elsewhere in the county, state, and country. My minister, who was with us, said a prayer reflecting on the impact and the sorrow of the Cravens family as they witnessed this violence. As you see, accompanying us on that tour was Betsy Conrad, of the beloved leader of this historical society, who embraced the importance of understanding all of this challenging history. She supported the library's history work, she encouraged my research, and in the summer of 2019, she invited me to give this presentation for the society. Betsy surprised us on that day by sharing a special find, a gift given to the Historical Society by Mary Bell Porter. The gift was a pulpit plate or collection plate from the Burlington Universalist Church. This is a photo of Betsy and my minister from Cincinnati, the Reverend Mitra Jafarska. I'm sure many of you know Mary Bell, some of you anyway, local folks. I am delighted to share that last week I had the pleasure of visiting with this 99-year-old, gonna be 100 in January, amazing person, Mary Bell Porter. and learning the full story of how she came to have this special keepsake, as well as more about the Universalist Church in Burlington. She shared with me that May Lassing, the last remaining member of the Universalist Church in Burlington, sold the church building around 1950 to her cousin for $350. That's a bargain. And when he tore it down to build his house, he found that the lumber was still quite good, so he used it to frame his house. So the bones of the first Universalist Church of Burlington live on in that small house at the corner of Bulletsville Road and Perla. Mary Bell sends her greetings to all of you. One of the sacred symbols of Unitarian Universalism today is a lit chalice, so I like to think of this item from the past as a precursor for today's symbol of Unitarian Universalism. I want to thank you for coming on this journey with me. I hope you found it interesting. I want to give deep thanks to Hillary and to Bridget Stryker, the director of the Borderlands Archive and History Center, for all they do to tell the stories of Boone County. I'm really grateful to Betsy and to Mary Bell Porter for their work to preserve the history of our county. I have handouts and a few books to show if you're curious, and we'll be happy to take questions or visit with you after the business meeting. Thank you.